Hello and welcome to video lecture 2A, the structure of moral decision making. Being an ethical organizational leader means making choices that uphold acceptable moral standards, promoting justice, fairness, consideration, protection of rights, etc. Making such choices can often be extremely difficult. And in lecture 2B, we will study a methodology by which we can greatly increase the likelihood of making the right decisions at such times. In preparation for that methodology, we must first talk a bit about the very structure of moral decision making itself. The problem we face as ethical organizational leaders, or as anyone trying to make a moral decision, is the moral dilemma. A moral dilemma is a dilemma in which the results are undesirable because no matter what you do, it looks like you're doing something wrong. It's what we're dealing with when we speak of choosing the lesser of two evils, or when we say pick your poison, or damned if you do, damned if you don't. Would you tell a lie in order to save a friend a lot of trouble or a lot of money? Would you steal medications you can't afford in order to save your spouse's life? Moral dilemmas are the only occasion in which we would have to bother with thinking through what we do. If it is obvious what one choice is right and what is wrong, then there's nothing to think about. We just do what's right. We do, don't we? But faced with a moral dilemma, we need to make a moral decision. In other words, we need to come to a conclusion that one of our choices is the right thing to do in this situation. The only way to arrive at a good and justifiable moral decision is through moral reasoning. Reasoning, of course, is the critical analysis process we go through when making any important decision. Moral reasoning, then, is a critical analysis process concerning a decision about morality. Moral decision making involves three kinds of input. First, we need to consult the relevant moral principles. Then we will need some information. Finally, we'll have to do some deliberation. Let's start with the moral principles. There's a lot of debate in philosophical ethics over just what moral principles are and how we can know them. But, as I've mentioned before, this is not a full-blown ethics class, so we will not bother with these questions, though they are a lot of fun to talk about. For our purposes, we can agree that moral principles are general guidelines about proper moral behavior, guidelines such as honesty or justice. Furthermore, the moral principles we will be talking about in this class are intuitively clear. That is, their position as moral principles is not really debated by anybody. It seems obvious that these principles should be followed. Again, think about honesty or justice. Do you know anyone who would seriously say we should not pursue these ideals? We may disagree over what action would be just or honest or fair, but we're not going to say, well, who cares about being fair, or justice isn't important. So, what kind of information will we need? First, we'll need to make sure we are clear on all of the relevant facts. That is, facts that must be considered in order to make a good moral decision. We'll also need to identify the relevant stakeholders and the interests of those stakeholders that are at stake in the decision to be made. We'll talk more about stakeholders and the role they play in moral decision making for organizational leaders next week in video lecture 3A. For now, suffice it to say that a stakeholder is anyone whose life will likely be affected in some significant way by the decision to be made, whether for better or for worse. In other words, stakeholders are the people with a stake or an interest in the decision. It will matter to them and to their lives what decision is made. So, on to deliberation. This is the weighing and evaluating process that gets us from the recognition of a moral dilemma to the resolution of a moral decision. Proper deliberation requires several steps. We must identify exactly what the moral issue or issues at stake are. In other words, we need to define as specifically as possible exactly what the moral problem is that needs to be resolved. We also need to determine which moral principles are applicable to this problem. As we will soon see, there is a good deal of moral principles, and they will not all apply to every situation. Furthermore, as we will see, a standard moral dilemma will involve at least 2 moral principles, and of those there might be 2 or 3 more that have some application as well. But seldom, if ever, will there be more than that really weigh in. We also need to identify what our alternative actions are. What are the realistic options that we have in trying to resolve the problem? What are the different kinds of ways we could solve the issue? We should then make a list of pros and cons for each of these alternatives. These may be moral pros and cons, or they may simply be practical pros and cons. As much as possible, we need to understand what the upside and the downside of each option is. Remember, we're in a dilemma. So whatever we do, there are going to be pros and cons. There are going to be reasons to do it and reasons not to do it. We need to get as good a handle on that as possible for each of the alternatives. Finally, we'll need to subject all of this, all that we've learned in this process, to the process of criticism and weighing. Given the facts, the shareholder interest, the applicable principles, the alternative actions, and their pros and cons, how do these alternatives compare to one another? In the end, which is the best thing to do? Once this last question is answered, the moral reasoning process is over and we have our moral decision. These are the necessary components of good moral reasoning: information and deliberation. In Lecture 2B, we will return to all of these concepts and arrange them into a clear and workable step-by-step process for reasoning from a moral dilemma to a moral decision. For now, we need to talk more about moral principles, since they are the foundation of any moral decisions. In fact, we're going to create a list of 14 moral principles that apply to a whole lot of the moral dilemmas we will face in our lives. As we will see, these are by no means the only moral principles there are, but they all have that intuitive quality we were just talking about. They are all so clearly the right thing to do that we don't have to worry about any serious objection to them. Many of these principles are derived from the work of 20th century British philosopher W.D. Ross, whom you read about in this week's web reading. You will undoubtedly recognize many of these as from Ross's list of what he calls prima facie duties. I've changed some of the names, but the ideas are the same. And by the way, if you've not yet read the web reading, you should stop this video and go read it. It will help the following material make more sense. It's not very long at all. It should only take you 15 or 20 minutes, if that long. I'm talking about the reading by Jan Garrett, on W.D. Ross's moral theory. Now, the first of our moral principles is non-injury. Don't do anything that will cause harm to others. This is not just talking about physical harm. This includes any damage done to a person's life, physical, psychological, personal, financial, etc. The point is, don't do anything that will likely leave others worse off than they were before you acted. The second is similar to non-injury, but with a very important difference. It is the principle of harm prevention. This is also a prohibition against harm to others. However, it's not just about doing bad things to others. It's about keeping bad things from happening, things that you didn't do. If you see someone is about to be harmed, do what you can to keep it from happening, even if it isn't your fault. If you become aware of the danger, you should take any opportunity you have to keep it from happening or to lessen its impact. Next is beneficence. This is the opposite of do no harm, harm prevention, or non-injury. This says do good. In addition to not making people's lives worse, we should also act to make people's lives better. Now let's pause for a minute to look at these first three duties. They all have directly to do with the effects we can have on other people's lives. It is often possible for us to hurt people. We should not take those opportunities. It is also often possible for us to keep people from being hurt or even to do something good for them. We should take those opportunities. Recall our definition of morality from Lecture 1B. Morality is an attitude of concern for human well-being from a broad and non-self-interested perspective. Morality is at its core a matter of seeing other people as important in and of themselves. These three principles speak directly to this definition. The next principle is honesty. This is the prima facie duty Ross calls fidelity. We should speak and behave honestly. We should properly represent ourselves to the world. We should keep our promises. We should not engage in manipulation or deception. Our lives should be WYSIWYG, if you know that term. It was very popular back in the 80s and 90s when computers were, desktop computers and laptops were first coming into vogue. It stands for what you see is what you get. We now have a couple of principles that might not be as apparent as the first four that we've already looked at. The first of these is gratitude. It might not be clear what this means at first. Gratitude, of course, is thankfulness. We are thankful because someone has done something beneficial for us. But being thankful is not really an action. It's a feeling or an acknowledgement of sorts. However, there are two obvious ways our thankfulness can be carried out in actions. The first is that we could return the graciousness, do something beneficial for the one to whom you are thankful. The other way is to pay the graciousness forward. Someone has been kind to you, so you should be kind to someone else. We would all think of these actions as wonderful gestures. However, according to Ross, they're more than that. They are duties morality demands of us. And I agree with him. Next is reparation. You may not be really familiar with this word, but it comes from the verb to repair and means to make up for any harm that we've caused. So if you failed to live up to non-injury, you should then do what you can to repair the damage you caused. Again, morality is about seeing others as important in and of themselves. We do not have the right to interrupt their lives in harmful ways. Some people argue about whether or not this principle applies in situations where you caused the harm but didn't do it intentionally. The way I see it, and the way many ethicists see it, the key issue is the harm you caused, not your intentions at the time. The person's life is damaged because of your action. The burden of reparation is on you, whether it was your fault or not. We complete this column with the principle of justice. Justice is about treating everyone in the community fairly. Discussion of what exactly fair treatment amounts to would take an entire course in itself. In fact, many colleges have entire courses that do just that. For now, we can borrow from American philosopher John Rawls and think of justice as the distribution of benefits and burdens fairly within a community. In other words, people are not required to contribute to the community any more than they should. Tax burden is an obvious example here. Furthermore, they will receive their fair share of the good things a community offers, like safety, public recreation, entertainment, opportunities for scholarship, and other forms of community assistance, etc. Now, our second column of principles begins with self-improvement. This basically means that we should practice beneficence, non-injury, and harm prevention on ourselves. We should take care of ourselves and work to better ourselves, like you're doing right now by being in school. Now, these 8 principles correspond to the prima facie duties that Ross first introduced and Garrett discusses in our web reading. But you'll recall that Garrett proposes 3 additions to Ross's list, and they are all excellent suggestions. So we will put them on our list here. First, there is respect for rights. Now, Garrett actually says respect for freedom, but I think rights is more accurate here for reasons that I won't bore you with. All people around us have rights, human rights, civil rights, rights because of their position or station or because of their relationship to us. By definition, it is immoral to violate the rights of another person. So respect for rights demands a place on our list and in our priorities. Next is special care. Again, I've changed Garrett's wording here. He simply says care. And again, I will not bore you with the reasons. In Lecture 1B, we talked about the ethics of care and its emphasis on the different relationships we hold with people and how they affect what those people have the right to expect from us. This principle states that we should act to honor the special rights that those close to us have: spouses, partners, family members, good friends, employers, other community relationships. The third of Garrett's 3 additions is non-parasitism. This time I stuck with Garrett's wording. It's an ugly and unfamiliar expression, but I simply couldn't think of anything better. This principle basically demands that we not be parasites. That's where the word comes from. Or we should not be leeches on society or our families. We should pull our weight. We should do what we can to contribute. Each member of a community who benefits from that community should also contribute to it so that others may benefit. That's how community works, whether it's your family, your neighborhood, or your nation. I will finish our list off with 3 more principles that I think are comparable with these in importance and frequency of application. The first of these is universalizability. Talk about ugly and unfamiliar words. But again, there's really not a better one for this concept. I take this principle from the Ethics of Immanuel Kant, whom you read about and we talked about briefly last week. Kant believed that there was one basic rule in morality. We must act according to the way we think everybody should act. Should everybody tell the truth? Yes. So we should tell the truth. Should everybody take things that don't belong to them? No. So we should not take things that don't belong to us. So we must do something only if it is universalizable, if it is something that everybody should do. We use this intuition all the time. We say things like, what if everybody acted that way? We understand that when it comes to morality, nobody is special. What is required of any of us is required of all of us. Next is utility maximization. This, as you might guess, comes from the theory of utilitarianism, which we also covered last week. However, I want to broaden our concept of utility behind the pleasure-pain concept so often in focus that we talked about last week. Instead, we will think of utility as the promotion of benefits, any contribution that makes a person's life easier, and the avoidance of harm, any contribution that makes a person's life worse. So utility maximization says that we should do that which will bring about the greatest balance of benefit over harm for everyone involved. Now there are tens of thousands of printed pages arguing over what exactly this principle comes to. But again, all we need is this intuitive idea that we apply all the time. Consider the consequences of your actions and do that which will maximize the beneficence and minimize the harm. Finally, there is the golden rule. We should act toward others the way we think others should act toward us. This must be the most widely quoted and applied moral principle in history. Every major religion in the history of the world has something in their sacred writings that amounts to the golden rule. I'm frankly a little surprised that neither Ross nor Garrett included it. Now just a couple of quick notes though on this very familiar guideline. First, notice what the golden rule does not say. It does not say we should treat others the way they have treated us. This is not an eye for an eye or payback's a bitch. The entreaty here is to behave properly toward others regardless of how they behave toward you. Second, notice what else it doesn't say. The golden rule does not say treat others the way you want to be treated. Just because we want something doesn't mean we should get it. Any parent knows that what a child wants is often exactly what she should not have. Morality is about doing what's best for others, not what others desire. So the golden rule calls on us to carefully examine exactly what would be in another's best interests and then act accordingly. There's much more to say, but this lecture is too long already. In Lecture 2B, we will go over some important points about moral principles in general, and then present the step-by-step moral decision-making procedure I promised before.